Hello and welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell and I'm Associate Counsel here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And with final in-person voting for the midterm elections yesterday and votes, of course, still being counted everywhere in the coming days and weeks, we wanted to discuss some of the issues that FFRF works on related to elections, especially electioneering by churches and also church polling places. So as always, you can put your questions in the Facebook chat or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Joining me today is one of FFRF's staff attorneys, Chris Line. Thanks for being here, Chris. And to start us off, I wanted Chris to just describe what does electioneering means, where does that concept come from, and how does this issue arise at FFRF?
Yeah, so electioneering generally is, any sort of promotion of different candidates, parties, just being involved in politics. But what matters for us is church electioneering, which is when churches choose to get involved in politics. And as you know, the Johnson Amendment is a rule for nonprofits that says that nonprofits, which includes churches, cannot advocate for or against candidates for office. So they can't be trying to help certain candidates win. For the most part, can't even advocate for parties, because then you're going to be advocating for candidates by saying, oh, this party should win. You're really endorsing all those candidates. But besides that, there's a lot of things that they can do. So you can be involved in politics in terms of like encouraging people to vote, things like that. So we hear a lot of different ways. We have our complaints come in through our normal complaint structure. A lot of times on Twitter, we're getting tagged when people say, hey, watch this video of this pastor saying that you have to vote for Republicans or whatever, the thing is, or endorsing the specific candidate. So we get a lot of that. Yeah, those are the type of complaints we usually receive.
Right. So we did do an episode actually on politicking pastors a few months ago, but we wanted to kind of bring up some of the broader ways that churches can violate this IRS regulation. So you mentioned it's the Johnson Amendment. That's where it comes from. This was passed in 1954. It goes way back. It's an IRS rule that binds all nonprofit and charitable organizations, which churches are. So organizations like ours, 501c3s, and churches cannot engage in campaign intervention. We call it electioneering because that's kind of a handy term to point to the fact that we're talking about things that are focused on actual elections, and so the timing usually is really significant. Like if it's an election year, and you're hearing, because there's no magic words, right? It's not obviously saying vote for this candidate or vote against that candidate is obviously a violation, especially pronounced in an election year. But there's no magic words that you can say to kind of shroud your intention to intervene on behalf of a candidate. You can talk about, there's only one candidate and party that like God would approve of on the issue of abortion. And if you're saying that in an election year, you're probably skirting close enough to the rules that you're violating the spirit of the rule.
Yeah, and it's incredibly frustrating because, I'm involved, I do some of our tweets sometimes and things like that. So the amount of effort I have to put into to go, we can't retweet this because it mentions a candidate and things like that, for us to make sure FFRF is following this rule. But then to see these videos of churches and pastors who just come out and say, vote for these people, and tell their parishioners, like, here's how you need to vote, and, being super involved in politics when we have to work so carefully to follow the rules and make sure, we can't even retweet this great post because it offhandedly mentions a candidate or something, or in some ways tangentially touches on an election.
And most C3s, like our coalition organizations, people we know that work at nonprofit organizations, what you're describing are like scrupulously adhering to the Johnson Amendment, probably being overly cautious about whether or not any given communication from their organization could be interpreted as endorsing or opposing a candidate. So it can be really frustrating to see how flagrantly churches are flouting the law that prevents campaign intervention and complaining about the law, because it is a very small limit on what you can and can't say and advocate. So like, we just don't want, you have tax exempt status, and that means taxpayer money supports what you do and your charitable mission. And we don't want that to be yet another black hole for political giving if those groups can just take that tax exempt status and just be basically yet another arm of a political campaign for public office. And so there are other ways in which we can speak on social issues. We can do a certain amount of lobbying depending on our budgets. By we, I mean C3s and churches. We can do get out the vote campaigns. We can host candidate forums that are not geared towards promoting a specific candidate. We can do all kinds of things that are, participating in the democratic process. There's only one thing we can't do, which is endorse or oppose candidates.
Yeah, and that's really frustrating because, as you said, it's so simple, and there's so many ways that you can discuss important issues to you without specifically endorsing candidates. And in fact, you can get real close on the line, like make it pretty clear, what type of people an organization would want you to be voting for, but you just can't go all the way and say, vote for these people. You can talk about those issues.
Right.
And so that's frustrating. But people keep pushing the line. And unfortunately, the IRS is not doing enough about it, is a big part of the issue. I know ProPublica and the Texas Tribune have been doing a series of articles about this, and recently came out explaining that they did a FOIA, and the IRS has only looked into maybe a dozen churches in the past 10 years or something like that.
Right.
And I know that we personally here at FFRF report dozens of churches every year, and not iffy situations. There are a lot of iffy situations, but very clear situations where the pastors are coming out and saying, hey, IRS, we dare you to do something, like admitting what they're doing. You can watch that video from 3 months ago where we did the Politicking pastors, where we've got tons of video clips of, your Greg Locks and Joshua Fierstein going out and saying, vote for these people, and I know we're not supposed to do this, and I know I'm violating the law. Try to do something about it, and the IRS is still not doing it. I mean, we send dozens of complaints to the IRS every year. We get a form response back that says, hey, thank you, we'll look into this. We can't tell you what we're doing or anything about it because it's private information, but thanks for letting us know. And we,
Right.
Despite that, we still encourage people to do that because the more, at some point, hopefully there will be a critical mass where they go, oh, this one church, we've got 10,000 complaints, and like the entire world is watching and knows that the IRS is not doing what it's supposed to. Maybe we as an organization have to do something now.
Right.
We haven't reached that point yet, unfortunately, but hopefully we do. And this is a bipartisan issue or a problem.
Right.
The same Texas Tribune and ProPublica series mentioned how on one day, Beto O'Rourke was seen in a church speaking. He was endorsed by the pastor. He gave a little talk. And they basically said, hey, you need to vote for Beto O'Rourke. On that same day, at another church, Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, who's also up for election, also gave a talk at a church where he was endorsed, and they said, you need to vote for him. So this is not,
Right.
one party or something like that that's using this. It goes both ways. There's churches endorsing Democratic candidates, Republican. This is a bipartisan issue that everyone's violating this law, and nobody should. It's not this
Right.
isn't benefiting one party or the other. It's a benefit for all of us when we're not allowed to endorse candidates in this way with taxpayer funds.
So just to jump in on the candidates speaking at churches, because again, this is one where this is a nuanced situation because there are ways in which churches can lawfully host candidates to speak at churches. For example, they can, like acknowledging that churches are a source of community connection for campaigns to reach out to and try and connect to, communities in ways that they couldn't otherwise reach. But what needs to happen from the church's perspective is they need to not be seen as endorsing or opposing certain candidates, which means they can host candidate forums. They can invite both or all of the candidates for a given office to speak or speak in a series or something like that. And what they cannot do is bring and host their preferred candidate and basically have a candidate rally in their church or from their pulpit or even in, not at worship services, but in some other official church communication. So another example of this that was in the news this election cycle was there was a First Baptist church in Coeur d'Alene in Idaho that held a Keep Idaho Red rally. And without knowing all the facts, that sounds like a partisan event where all of the conservative Republican candidates were hosted at a Baptist church, just in flagrant violation of the Johnson Amendment. And so, there are ways in which this happens that's not just politicking from the pulpit, but those candidate endorsements that happen in this rally format is just as unlawful under the Johnson Amendment. And the Johnson Amendment's popular. People agree with the Johnson Amendment for all the blowback it gets from the conservative religious community and former President Donald Trump and evangelical allies. People understand that tax-exempt status is a privilege and not a right, and that it shouldn't come with the ability to just be a political, basically a pack of candidates for public office.
Right. But even on a practical level, it makes sense. I think about it. I don't want to, I'm doing my job here at FFRF trying to protect the separation of church and state. I don't want to be for a certain political party. And as we know, people on both sides of the aisle violate the separation of church and state all the time. There's both, Christianity is throughout both sides, is a vast majority of both Democrats, Republicans, even independents. Everybody is violating the separation of church and state a lot. And I don't want to have to think about that in my role. So it protects us as well to work in an organization and to really focus on our mission without getting sucked into politics and suddenly being well, now we're only going to talk about violations for one party or the other because we're a political entity now trying to help people win. No, we don't want to be a political entity. Churches shouldn't want to be a political entity.
Right.
You find the issues that are important to you and you should push for those, like us here pushing for the separation of church and state regardless of politics.
Right. And it's kind of a metaphor for the separation of church and state where both are pure when separate, although politics' hope of being pure is long gone.
Yeah.
But charitable organizations, that can pursue their mission with uncorrupted by being part of the political process. And the whole purpose of tax-exempt status is to support organizations with a charitable mission, with an educational mission, and there's no part of that describes the political campaign process.
And it's doubly bad for churches because at least for other nonprofits, we have to justify the fact that we're a nonprofit.
Right, financial accountability.
We have accountability. We have to say we're a charitable organization, that we're going to do work to advance society. Whereas churches, they just say, oh, we're a church, and they go, cool, welcome to the club. You're a nonprofit now, a charitable organization. You get all the tax benefits. You don't have to do anything for anyone. You don't have to help people. You can just be a church. It's just they get the benefit of the doubt to just start getting tax-exempt status, whereas groups like ours have to actually show that we're going to be using that money, using the resources to help advance society and to do good things for people.
Right. So what Chris is talking about is IRS tax-exempt accountability, which most of we organizations in the 501c3 space must file tax forms, just like you and everyone else who pays taxes in our country and our states. We have to file tax forms that show what we did with our money all year and financial transparency that shows the IRS that we are engaging in financial practices and uses of our budget that justifies our tax-exempt status. Churches are exempt from all of those filing requirements, which means most of them do not, and they are not required to file any tax forms with the IRS whatsoever. So they're basically a financial black box. What their financial operations are shrouded from public transparency and accountability, and they have the privilege of tax-exempt status already. So I don't think it's too much to ask to also not intervene in campaigns.
Yeah, and we've tried to challenge that to level the playing field many times. And I should also note, just so people know, obviously we're disheartened by the IRS's lack of enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, but we did actually sue them in 2012 because they weren't enforcing the Johnson Amendment. Unfortunately, that case ended with them sort of saying, here, we're giving some sort of nod and showing, oh, look, we've got a plan in place to kind of do this. But as is reported by ProPublica, it's looking like there is no, as far as we know, maybe one or two in the past couple of decades of churches have actually gotten tax exempt status removed.
Right.
It's not happening in the way that it should.
Right. It's a hard problem to solve through litigation, right? Like under enforcement of a tax regulation, although we've tried. And gotten some assurances from the IRS, but again, it's a political problem, so there will have to be pursuing. Right. We will have to be pursuing political solutions.
Deep political problem, because I know that my understanding is that for churches to be audited through this sort of process, this requires a sign-off from a higher-up person. And like, for example, during the Trump administration, that position did not actually even have anyone in it. So there literally was nobody to sign off to try to investigate these churches. Hopefully that's changed now. I know that recently there was additional funding given to the IRS, and I hope that they do something with that and they earn it, and that they go through and actually make some changes to make sure churches are not politicking, because it's beneficial sometimes to these churches, but also it's just very negative for the IRS. Like, it just makes it look really bad that, oh, these people have to follow the rules, these people don't, that's the status quo, and we're just gonna, it's not a good look for them.
And it's unfair to taxpayers, and people don't like it. We get a lot of complaints from members of the public, and it's not always non-religious or atheist parishioners. Like, sometimes we get, people are in a church, like, they're not necessarily our demographic, but we do hear from people who are like, hey, my pastor, like, today in Sunday service told us, like, we have to vote for blah, blah, blah. Like, is that okay? That didn't feel good. Like, people don't like being told, even religious people. We hear a lot of complaints about being told how to vote or who to vote for, or just having, like, politics infecting the like, practice of religion. So if they hear about politics from the pulpit, a lot of people are just that feels gross to people, and taxpayers, I think, understand that, like, they don't want to mix religion and politics, right? Like, that's just a bad mix. So.
Yeah, I mean, and we get those sort of complaints and things sometimes too, of people just, noting, like, hey, I'm supporting FFRF because of your mission to protect the separation of church and state, not to support any political party. And of course, we want to go with that because that's our mission, and we want to be able to stick to our mission without having to even think about politics, as that's irrelevant.
Right. So I wanted to move to one other issue that FFRF always receives complaints about particularly during election years and in these, election season months, and that is polling places that are located in churches. So much like people that don't like religion mixing with politics in services, a lot of people really do not like being forced to vote in a church. So you're seeing an image up, oh, gross. You're seeing an image up of just religious iconography, I'll call that. A gross portrait of, like, a bloody Jesus. There's, like, the figurehead Jesus above a ballot box. And this is, so many people, if you vote in person, you probably at some point have been told that your polling place is in a church. That looks like a poll worker wearing an Elect Jesus shirt, so that's not cool either. So, because there are a lot of rules around political speech, within however many 100 feet of a polling place, but people sort of have it in their mind, like, is it wrong that I'm forced to vote in a church, that my polling place is a church? It feels wrong. Here's what it was like. And, what can FFRF do? So what do we hear about on that front, and how do we handle?
Yeah, well, I'll just start by saying I did do some preparation work for this show yesterday. I did vote in a church. My polling place for the last 2 elections has been in a local church. Yep.
Is it in the sacred space, or is it in
It's more like a community room. It's
space.
just a big room.
Yeah.
Yep. There's those images we saw. I didn't see any portrait, and I look because it's on my I know how this works. So it's in my mind to think oh, are there going to be little Bible handouts, or is this going on? And there's not, and that's not really something I would expect in Madison anyway. But previously, my polling place had been a school.
Yeah.
For the past couple of years, and then now it just changed to a church. And so I think this issue can be very dependent on where you are, because here in Madison, it's a lot more progressive. I'm not super worried about a church abusing their polling place location, but also just I don't think that the local election officials are going to be picking a church for religious reasons, whereas not to pick on the South, but somewhere in Alabama or something choosing nope, we want everyone going into the local church to vote. I'm a little bit more suspicious about why they may have picked that and what's going to be allowed.
Right. Well, we should say first that courts have actually approved or said that church polling places do not generally in and of themselves amount to a constitutional violation. Mm-hmm. So a lot of complainants are surprised to hear that there's not really a constitutional problem as far as courts are concerned with voters having their polling place assigned to be a house of worship, at least as long as there's a reasonable alternative if a voter were to object. And because absentee voting is pretty much available everywhere, that would be deemed a sufficient alternative to in-person voting. Yeah. So oftentimes there's not a constitutional requirement that can be enforced there. So, but just because it's not unconstitutional does not make it good policy. And it does not mean that people don't really get upset and mad about it. Right. So we do act on complaints, especially where the polling place is really a religious environment, right? Religious imagery is prominent, or worse, like the poll worker with the Jesus shirt, right? There's religious pressure being brought to bear on voters. But we know that there have been local voters that have had success getting their polling places moved to secular locations, even though it might not be under threat of litigation or under, order of law.
And so as you saw, those are the more serious ones that we see where we actually write on it. It's the portrait of Jesus over the ballot box, political or religious messages on a shirt, or people being preached or proselytized to, we've heard about. We've also heard about, it being kind of enmeshed in the church, people are coming in for church service at the same time as voting. Mm-hmm. And things like that, or having to hear the choir practice. Those are the type of things we hear where it's just
Yeah, I feel like Patrick, our senior counsel, I know he's not watching this, but a few years back, voted in a church where they were simultaneously doing a bake sale to support the church while voters were coming in and out, which seemed exploitative. Soliciting
donations, anything like that would be extremely inappropriate during this sort of thing. And luckily, unlike the IRS thing, like I said, when we complain about the electioneering IRS thing, we just get a form letter back. We actually do receive really good responses on these because they do take this very seriously. So when we write to local election officials and say, hey, we got these complaints about one of your polling locations, we get good substantive responses, actually taking the issue seriously. Many times the polling locations are changed. So even if you're not seeing something egregious like the Jesus portrait above, if you just feel uncomfortable voting there, definitely let your local officials know. And you can report it to us too. We're probably not going to take action unless there's something more serious like the imagery and stuff. But definitely people should make their voices heard if they're uncomfortable voting in a church, because that's not something you should be forced to do.
Right. And again, this is a lot like the actual Establishment Clause space. This is one where people see the sort of it's not a violation, but people people feel the ickiness when it affects them and when they can be like put in the shoes of a non-Christian person. Because the vast majority of polling places, because the vast majority of churches in our nation or houses of worship are Christian churches. But we were talking on the podcast about an example out of Boca Raton where from like the 2010 election to the 2016 election, there was a community in Boca Raton, which is South Florida, that there was a polling place located in a community mosque. And in 2016, there was like controversy bubbled up because there were people in the community that were assigned to vote in that location that just didn't want to. Like they didn't want to enter a mosque, an Islamic house of worship, to vote. And through just community outrage and complaining to the local board of elections, they moved that polling place for the post 2016 elections. So I mean, people understand that they don't want to be made to sort of like, again, like enter a house of worship
Right.
that doesn't align with their own faith when they're doing something as important as voting.
Yep.
And one of the things we actually talk about that is a really important, like social science reason to have that as good policy, secular polling locations, is that there's a lot of good social science data that shows the effect of priming on voters and polling place priming. And so what that means is just the environment that you vote in has a mostly subconscious effect on voting behavior. And there's multiple studies that have shown that voters who are voting in a church are more likely to vote for conservative candidates and conservative positions, like positions that are anti-LGBTQ and other kind of conservative ballot initiatives and things, that something about being in a conservative space, and of course the more religiously priming the environment is, the more like activated people's Christian values or identities, and it affects voting behavior.
Yeah, and that's not just the religious, not just in the religious context.
Right.
And I was reading that what a lot of poll workers will try to do is they will try not to have voting locations be in a school if there's a major school referendum going on.
Right.
Which makes sense. It's, we're going to vote on whether to give the schools more money or something, and everyone's going to vote in a school. You can see how that would prime you to be
Right.
more, it just would subtly affect your views. And, and it makes sense on all sides in terms of the environment you're in voting. Because, like, for example, I know recently, or relatively recently, the city of Madison had considered FFRF, our building, as a potential voting location. It didn't end up being made as one. But I also think it would be inappropriate if we had gotten chosen for us to have any signs that say there is no God, or something that would make religious people feel uncomfortable coming to vote here. I also, even to see it from the other side, it's like, no, it should be it should be a neutral place when you go to vote. It's
Right.
not a place to be pushing any sort of message. People should just be able to come out, vote, because we want people to vote, everyone to vote, and to feel comfortable doing so. So it's not just a church issue. And as you had noted,
Right.
obviously Christians, I think, make very clear something like voting in a mosque would not be okay with them.
Right.
But then at the same time, they would say, well, it's just a church. It's no big deal. You just
Right.
go in and vote or whatever. But then whenever it gets flipped back on them, suddenly the outrage ensues. So
Right. And I mean, like you said, priming is a psychological phenomenon. It's not limited to churches, but I think it's really important to understand that when in the social science data, like obviously controls for race and party and sex and age and all these other factors, and you still see conservative positions and candidates being like having outsized support from voters who are voting in churches. And I think that that's important when we're deciding, okay, well, what spaces do we want to choose for our voters to vote in? And I mean, priming is just another way of describing like subliminal messages, and this affects like all of our behaviors. This is like when you hear French music, and that's why you want to like go buy a bistro set and a French outfit and French wine. And so priming is nothing, exceptional or limited to churches, but I do think it like really, it really helps understand why, as a policy matter, it's really inappropriate to have these spaces like we saw on the images, because we don't want to influence voting behavior in that way.
And it's harder maybe in like a rural area where maybe there's not a lot of big community buildings. Then it's probably more likely to end up in a church. But I know in bigger cities, I don't think there's any ill will. Like, they're not trying to put things in churches. They're just looking around and being like, oh, here's the buildings that work, and they're just picking one that works, and it happens to be a church. So in those situations, I think they're much more likely to, if you raise a stink and say, hey, we don't like this, to go ahead and move it. They didn't pick the church with any specificity, so they're more willing to pick a different location,
Right. So I am actually going to see if we have any comments or questions or other audience participation. So let's see here. Okay, so Tracy M writes a comment. I wish FFRF would let us tell them about churches we find online where they're violating the Johnson Amendment, and FFRF can then report that church to the IRS. Can we do that? That is literally exactly what you can do, which is, what's the legal report? Intake report website? Is it just ffrf.org/legal/report, I believe. Yeah. You can find it on our website. Very easy to navigate. Go to our website. It says report a violation. Click there.
Yep.
You can report any church electioneering that you see as you're out and about in the election season. And if it does amount to a violation of the IRS rules, we do report those churches to the IRS despite under enforcement problems.
Yep. And we have a pretty... We've got a pretty good process down too, so it's not burdensome for us if you want to report it. It's not like, oh, I don't think it's worth FFRF's time to do this. It's definitely worth time to always send in those violations to us, and we can go ahead and try to get that resolved, or at least make it known to the IRS that this is going on, so there's some chance that they could do something.
Yeah. This is an interesting question. If a polling place is a mosque, do voters have to remove their shoes when entering the building, as is required for Muslims? That would be an amazing hypothetical to... See, this is the problem.
This is a question you shouldn't even have to think about. Yeah.
Because why should a mosque have to? I mean, this is why it should really go both ways, where like churches should not be forced to open their doors to the public for voting, but also people should not be required to like engage in this religious practice to enter.
There's different levels to this. Obviously, the first practical level is no, you shouldn't have to. The second, then you can go to the second level and say, well, but the Supreme Court really values religion now.
Right.
And would say yes. But then you hit the third level, which is, but it really only values Christianity. So it actually may not support Muslim rights in the same way.
So when you put it through the meat grinder, you really don't know how something like that would come out.
So I think at the end of the day, realistically, if this happened, you would not be required to wear your shoes. You could go without, and I think that's the way it would come out.
I do think, too, like, when we're talking about a truly secular reason why a board or clerk would select a church or house of worship, religious space for a polling place, in other words, there's a dearth of secular buildings that can accommodate, the amount of people expected on in-person voting day. I think it's an easy enough thing to do to find the non-consecrated spaces, the community buildings, and those places can be secularized and, made to be somewhat comparable to voting in a secular
Right, you don't
building.
need to put the voting machine on the altar, so you have to walk up and
Exactly. Okay, question. We're really, they're just hitting us big here. Is there any way to eliminate churches from being polling places? I mean, as we are talking about here, like, no, there's not really a legal mechanism for that.
There's a political one, though. I mean, these are chosen by local officials. And so if you tell your officials this is what you want and that's what is known, they have the ability to not choose them. I mean, that's really the way to do it.
And I mean, in that sense, I do think we sometimes get more cooperation on some of these complaints, even though, but boards of elections or county clerks or whoever is the chosen person in a given municipality that selects polling places. I mean, we often have some more success convincing, just on a policy basis, convincing them to select a secular location. It's not because we're threatening to sue them if they don't. It's because, we're kind of engaging in this conversation about our complainants, why this is a problem for them, their voters in your county, and here's what the space looks like. Yeah. Here's what the social science data says. Like, here are the alternatives, and it's just it's a political solution to the problem.
Well, and on the other hand, too, we do often, both with this issue and with like events in church type complaints that we do, sometimes we do get real response from people who truly have no bias towards religion. They're not trying to do it, and they will just explain. We'll get a 10-page long response, like explaining, like, no, listen, we really did not want to put this in a church either. Right. But if you look, we'll explain to you why every single other location nearby doesn't work.
Right.
And like we understand your concerns. We don't want to have to be choosing a church, but for whatever reason, like this has to take place in a church. And then oftentimes, luckily with those are the ones where they're willing to say, and here's what we've done. We've told the local church, like, you can't do this. You can't be involved with this. No church, That's another point to point out, is that oftentimes church officials are not at all involved, and they shouldn't be. It's run by the local election people. You've got them coming in. It's not like the church itself runs the election. I think that could be a misconception people could come up with. They're like, oh, it's happening in a church. The church must be involved. No, the space is there, and then it's all done by the election people to make sure that they're not involved.
Right, and that's how it should be.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is a question that I do not know the answer to. Do polling places get monetary compensation for participation for acting as polling places? I don't think so.
I also don't know for sure, but I would be extremely surprised if they do. I don't think that they do. Which I will say, this brings up one positive point for church polling locations, is that these are tax-exempt buildings that sit empty 90% of the time. You got Sunday, maybe a Wednesday night, they'll do something, So if you're looking for a building that's a community space that's open on a Tuesday but not busy, I know people mention banks and things as locations.
And that taxpayers are already subsidizing.
We're already paying for it. So
in that way, it makes sense that they should be at the ready and open to local government to be used if necessary.
Yeah, and provided they follow the rules and there's no proselytizing, there's no religious imagery, they're doing it in like a community room, like you said, as opposed to like the sanctuary. It's actually a great opportunity. We should be utilizing these tax-exempt spaces. It's the least they can do to give back to the community, for all the benefits that they get.
But I mean, of course, you do get just the benefit of priming voters in your space.
There's that too.
And this always reminds me of how the first year or two that I lived in Madison, my polling location was the Hy-Vee grocery store. And I definitely bought a bunch of stuff impulsively while I waited in line, because it was a really long line. Because if you can imagine, there's a really small private room and everyone else everyone lined up, kind of feeding into that room, lined up along the grocery store aisles.
Did they set up the way, like the cashier, all the candy and stuff right before they could just
kind of. It kind of went down like one of those middle aisles where you would have all the Halloween candy and seasonal stuff. So yeah.
Oh, that's just.
So that was a boon. That was monetary compensation for participation. That was a boon to Hy-Vee. That was weird. That was the only private business I've ever voted in.
Yeah, that's the first I've heard of something like that.
But anyway, I still preferred it over voting in a church. Got a little shopping done, voted, called it a day. Here is a big question that is totally off topic that I'm going to throw to you, and then maybe we'll close out. How do we combat people who are this is in the spirit of Election Day. How do we combat people who are taught to disregard facts for faith? Just a simple question for you to just
completely. Yeah, I'm a lawyer, not a. I don't even know who would deal with this.
Therapist?
Not a law, or something. No, I wonder that all the time. I mean, I have discussions with my colleagues, Ryan, anyone, when we're talking about the election, talking about the future of just what do you do if people don't believe in reality? If they don't know that, if you could show the facts and the truth, and they see it and go, okay, I see what you're saying, but no, I'm going to disregard that. What do you do?
Yeah, it's so hard.
And if I had an answer for that, I don't know. Hopefully I would be in a better position. I mean, I think it'd be great if someone has an answer. They should definitely let everyone know.
I'm gonna plug this thing that I only half know what it is, which is last night I was reading a book and it referenced in a totally different context Daniel Dennett, who wrote somewhere about basically persuasion. And it's this like 4-step process for persuading a target to your position. And, you know, it was my election night addled brain reading a book, but it was really compelling. And I think it's a good answer to this question for how to talk to people and be convincing when you're on totally different realms of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to not engage in stuff like that, but I know that people should. We've seen the results. You know, we've seen. Look at, I mean, our co-president Dan Barker is an evangelical pastor for 20 years, and goes on to become head of, you know, one of the largest atheist organizations. You know, like, so clearly somehow things are able to. I think also of Megan Phelps, who came and spoke at our convention last year. Or 2 years ago, a while ago, but like, you know, she was in the Westboro Baptist Church. I can't imagine you can get much more indoctrinated than that. And through talking with people on Twitter, just slowly over years and years and years, she was able to break free. And now she speaks on the opposite and tries to help other people, you know. So it's not everyone, you know, you can't convince everyone, you can't bring everyone into reality. But it clearly sometimes happens, even with those most deeply entrenched in misinformation and lies. And so I think if you have the stomach for it, go for it. Like, try to like help people, but don't, you know.
And there are tools out there for having these conversations. Yeah. Like, that's what the Daniel Dennett steps, I think, like, gave me. I think our instincts are not always spot on when it comes to talking to people who are basically need to deconstruct.
So I will just also say, before we close out, you mentioned the podcast, but you didn't say that it's We Dissent and that you are talking about...
that plug is obviously coming, Chris.
I didn't even realize, yeah.
Okay, let me get ahead of Chris here. That's all our questions, so I'm going to say that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week, and thank you for joining us. First, I'm going to plug FFRF's broadcast TV program. That is Free Thought Matters. And this week on Free Thought Matters, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker speak to world-famous actor and a free thought activist, John Delancey. He's best known as Q from the Star Trek franchise, and here's a preview.
I happen to not feel that we live in a world that's made simply for white people or white Christian people. And that lying for Jesus is not good. This notion that you are somehow relieved of being honest to be dishonest because, well, I'm doing it for a higher cause, so I can lie away. I just don't buy that. That's why right now, thankfully, a lot of, especially young people, are moving away from the evangelical movement. They're just going, wow, man, these guys are out of control.
You can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the U.S. on Sunday mornings or on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. And be sure to check out Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show and podcast. This week's guests are researcher Linda Lascola and writer Marin Gazaniga, who are part of the creative team that have brought the play The Unbelieving, the Story of the Clergy Project to life. It's currently playing off-Broadway in New York City. And to find out where to hear Free Thought Radio, you can visit ffrf.org/radio. And to not humbly let Chris plug my podcast, I'm going to do it myself. If you're interested, especially in a deeper dive on today's topic from the perspective of 4 women attorneys in the secular movement, including me, you can check out the We Dissent podcast. In our newest episode, which is going to drop next week, we are going deep into election issues. So you can find that anywhere that you get your podcasts. It is called We Dissent. And if you want more information, as always, about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. We will see you next time, next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.